Well, South Africa, which is a regular attendee of the G7, is not going to be taking part next month. It's because of a decision by Japan to rather invite the African Union, but not South Africa. So why is that? Well, let's find out now from international relations expert Siphamandla Zondi joining us this morning. Hello, Siphamandla, and good to have you on ENC. Help me understand then, why did we get snubbed as South Africa, but the AU gets to go? What's your high line, your high level evaluation of that?
All right. Good morning. Good morning. We must understand a very simple distinction. The AU is 55 African countries. South Africa is one country. It was anyway always unfair, bit illogical, that the countries of the host of the G7 summit would invite 4 or 5 African, cherry pick 4 or 5 African countries to represent the rest, without any form of democratic decision about who represents Africa. So they would normally invite South Africa, Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, or countries of that format. They would select that these are the countries that somehow represent Africa. Yet there is no democratic process by which it is designated, they are designated as representing Africa. I think Japan has understood this and has decided rather not to invite these 5 countries, including South Africa, but rather invite the African Union because it represents the totality of the African countries. And of course, for South Africa and the other 4 countries that usually attend, it's a bit of a loss because while they are there, they don't only represent African interests, they also push their own national interests.
I can't help but wonder as well, Siphamandla, there's 2 things that come to mind for me. I don't know if this has any bearing, which is why I'm glad I'm talking to you. Could it be anything to do with the fact that the G7 has reaffirmed their support for Ukraine, where South Africa arguably is sitting on the fence? And then there's the small matter of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, coming to South Africa later this year, being hosted by BRICS. Does that have any bearing in this, do you think? Does it even come into the thinking of an organization like the G7?
It would make sense if the circumstances we talk about also happened to Nigeria, to Ghana, to Egypt, to Kenya, that usually also get invited as a group of countries. I don't think that is the main consideration. I think the consideration is Japan has decided it's going to be institutional because it is careful about which countries to choose. Think about Japan. Its relationship with Africa is quite old. It's comprehensive, what is called GIPSA. Partnership with Africa is quite big, but it is quickly being outcompeted by China, by the US, by the EU, and others who are moving aggressively on the African continent. Now, having to choose countries and exclude certain countries is a very tricky decision for Japan at a time when it needs to boost its relationship with Africa. And I can understand logically why then it would go for the AU rather than choose a number of countries and then have to explain itself at a time when it needs to relationship with Africa. And I don't think the EU, I don't think the G7 are scared of talking to countries that do not go along with the G7 position. They have now chosen the AU. The AU also is arguing we should abstain. The AU is also arguing that the militarization of Ukraine as a response to Russian invasion is wrong. And they also argue that we should move off this macho politics and go towards more peaceful resolution through diplomacy. So by inviting the AU instead of these African countries that are there, it doesn't make a difference. But also remember, the countries they usually invite include Ghana, include the 2 other countries that have voted with the G7 countries. They've also been excluded.
So I suppose if you think about it like this, South Africa doesn't, as a country and as a government, shouldn't really have to feel snubbed by this. As being part of the AU, they are, I suppose you could look at it, are part of this delegation as well. So is there any real reason for South Africans or the South African government to be upset, to feel snubbed that it wasn't our country, but it's the AU that's going instead? We shouldn't feel snubbed as a country, surely?
I haven't seen a government statement to that effect. I would be very surprised because it would be a sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
Why would South Africa feel entitled to represent Africa when it's only just one country of 55 countries? It would be very unfortunate. It would fit into this perspective that South Africa and South Africans feel that they should lead, and they should lead on behalf of Africa. Maybe because they are kind of a special country of some sort. It would be unfortunate if South Africa, or South Africans generally, felt snubbed when an AU is chosen over them when they are members of the AU.
Yeah, so just in closing, so you don't think it's the G7 trying to ditch South Africa? You don't think that's what this is?
It would make sense. It definitely would not make sense if, for example, a meeting, an international meeting, has been inviting Eastern Cape, Gauteng, and Free State to represent South Africa, and on one occasion decides, no, let us invite a national government of South Africa, which represents all of them. Why would Eastern Cape feel snubbed? It's a strange idea. I think it is born out of that perception of South African exceptionalism. It's a special country, it must be there. The AU is not very important. South Africa is of higher status. It's a problematic perspective in my view. If government holds that, I think it will be a very problematic turn of its outlook.
Well, for the moment, I'm going to say thank you very much. Good to speak to you. Siphamandla Zondi, International Relations Expert, joining us here on ENCA this morning. What's your take on South Africa not being invited? But as Siphamandla says, it's the African Union that is going, and Japan has their reasons. I'd love to hear from you on Twitter. You can tweet us. It's at ENCA. What you think is really going on. Siphamandla doesn't think it's something South Africa should be too concerned about because the AU as a collective is still going.